If these some of these slides appear dated and generic, it's because I'm dated and generic. I'm kind of like the Ramones. All right, so let's get into this. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about sightings of mountain lions. Please understand that if you have had a sighting or you know somebody who's seen one, we have very little evidence to back up sightings. So I'm not trying to dismiss or deny folks' sightings. Very often it's the most powerful experience people have with their wildlife experiences of seeing a mountain lion. So if you have had an experience like that, please consider yourself blessed. All right, let's get going. Okay, so the talk is called Bringing Back the Legend, Cougar Recovery in Eastern North America. The history of cougars, pumas, panthers, mountain lions, are all the same big cat on the East Coast, their current status, and then recovery, about what it would take to bring them back. My name is Chris Spatz, and when I'm not bartending at the Mohonk Mountain House, I do things with Cougar Rewilding Foundation. So our game plan, we're going to talk about the history of the foundation, how we got started, my story, how I got into this, the search about trying to find evidence of mountain lions on the East Coast, ecology and recovery, and we'll do questions and answers. So Todd Lester was a young coal miner and a houndsman living in southern West Virginia, where Todd still lives. And one day back in 1983, he was out looking for one of his lost dogs. He was on a trail, came around a corner, and was suddenly face to face with one of these big cats. And they looked at each other for a couple of seconds, which probably felt like a few minutes for Todd. And the cat just turned around and went right back up the trail. And Todd has described his experience ever since then this way. When that cougar turned tail, a piece of my soul went with it. Now, when Todd had his experience, nobody really knew what the status of the Eastern cougar was. They were thought to have been wiped out largely by the end of the 19th century. Many states had bounty programs in place meant to eradicate them. A lot of those bounty programs were on the books into the 20th century. So anybody who wanted to could have shot one. But the only one we see turning up like that in the Northeast was in Maine in 1938. By the 1950s and 60s, a couple of them started popping up again. One was shot in Pennsylvania, one turned up dead in the Adirondacks. And of course, sightings of them persisted throughout the 20th century. So when the Endangered Species Act was established in 1973, the Eastern cougar was listed as an endangered species. Bob Downing, a biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, tried to find them unsuccessfully in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And Rainer Brock, a biologist from New York State, tried to find them unsuccessfully in the Northern Appalachians and the Adirondacks. So this is a map of our sister organization, the Cougar Network, which I am using with their permission. And these are confirmations, not sightings, but physical evidence of mountain lions outside their known breeding habitat. So this is where they are out west. You get about 30,000 of them out there in Canada and the United States. We have these source colonies in the Dakotas and Nebraska. And these dots represent physical evidence, tracks, scat, photographs, deer kills, bodies of cougars coming out of these source colonies. Almost all of them are young males, and a lot of these are multiple confirmations of single individuals, like this cluster down here. So you see I have a lot more of these in the Midwest than we do on the East Coast. You may have heard about the cat that was killed in Connecticut back in 2011. 3 of these are from him. So in 1993, Todd did find tracks in southern West Virginia. He made casts of those tracks. They were confirmed by biologists, but because the biologists didn't see the tracks in the ground, it's not considered an official confirmation. In 1998, Todd and a writer from Virginia named Chris Bolgiano, who has written a couple of cougar books, formed the Eastern Cougar Foundation. They put together a board of directors, including some of the top cougar biologists in the country. They started a website and a newsletter, and they began soliciting sightings, trying to find evidence of mountain lions from Nova Scotia to Mississippi. They also put together a set of missions and goals. I'm going to skip through some of those to get to the most important one, which is evaluating evidence and conduct investigations that document cougar presence. So when we were formed in 1998, we wanted to find evidence. We were built to find evidence, and we had some of the top cougar biologists and advocates in the country evaluating that evidence. Okay, so how did I get into this? I've been rock climbing here in the Gunks since 1975. That's a picture of me on a route called Shockley Ceiling back in 1983. And Yes, we do climb naked in the gunks. I don't do that much anymore. So the entire time I've been climbing here, I've been hearing reports about mountain lions on the ridge. And it's when I moved here in 2000, one of my ambitions was to try to find evidence of them or maybe even seeing one. So I began collecting sightings. By 2006, I had 50 of them, some of them going back to the 1950s, some including the Smileys right at the Mohawk Mountain House. But I couldn't get close enough to one of these sightings to try to find evidence, to try to find tracks or scattered deer kills, till I read about a couple down in Vernon, New Jersey, just over the New York-New Jersey border on the edge of the Wallkill National Wildlife Refuge, who had an experience in their backyard with what they described as a mom cougar and her nearly adult-sized cub. So I drove down to Vernon, I interviewed the Fitzgeralds, and then I began driving down there a couple days a week because Sean Fitzgerald was a cop in town, and they kept getting reports of these same two cats throughout that summer. So Sean feed me a report. I'll drive down there within a couple of days or an hour to try to find evidence. I bought my first remote wildlife camera. I put that up in their backyard on the edge of the Wallkill Refuge, and I got pictures of these little guys the first day. So I was psyched because the camera works. And if you happen to know anything about northern New Jersey, it has one of the densest black bear populations in North America. They're everywhere, especially in a town like Vernon. So I've been knocking on people's doors, asking about cougar reports, and they'd say, no mountain lions, but that black bear came right down the street again this morning, right past the school bus stop. Right past the school bus stop. And you're okay with that? They said, yeah, we're used to them now. And I was like, holy cow. I grew up an hour southwest of Vernon. We didn't have black bears in my town when I was growing up. So I was blown away that people in the suburbs of New Jersey, 40 miles from Times Square, had gotten used to living with these 400, 600, 800-pound animals. These guys get huge in New Jersey. I thought, wow, if we can live with black bears in our suburbs who do more damage and kill more people than mountain lions do, maybe we can live with mountain lions in our suburbs as well. By that fall, I hadn't found any evidence or gotten any photographs, but I began getting reports at High Point State Park in the northern tip of New Jersey. So I sat down with the park superintendent, got permission from the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and set up a couple of cameras in the park. The cougars, just like dogs and wolves, use urine and scat to mark the territory. So I went to a local zoo, got myself a 20-pound bag of cougar poo, and I put that out in front of the cameras as a potential lure. And dogs were attracted to it. Deer were attracted to it. People were attracted to it. By the end of that year, no tracks, no scat, no deer kills, no photographs. That's roadkill. So I wrote up my report, packed up the cameras, and moved them a little bit further north to Minnewaska State Park here on the ridge. That's my friend Bob O'Brien. Bob used to be the invasive species specialist. We skied out in December of 2007 to set up the cameras. You can see that one right there. Those are motion sensitive. When an animal gets to within about 30 feet, it takes a picture, it takes a flash, which takes a picture on a memory card. So I had the cameras out for a year, put out the cougar poo, had the cameras out for a year, got pictures of everything except mountain lions. So I packed them up again, moved them a little bit further north to the Mohawk Preserve, which surrounds the hotel. This is the Clove Valley, just west and south, about 1,000 feet south or below the hotel. I began running a report in the Bluestone Press, soliciting cougar reports, and I've had a dozen in this valley during the last 15 years. So I set up one of the cameras right in this hemlock grove, right behind Aiden Quinn's house. And of course, Manny Potemkin lives down there. Daniel Craig lives down there, near there. Michelle Leo, Steve Buscemi, Harvey Keitel. This valley's lousy with actors and mountain lion reports. And by this time, I had run out of the cougar poo and begun reading that perfumes like Obsession for Men work really well as a wildlife lure. So I got some of that, put that out in front of the cameras, and it attracted everything, including porcupine, fisher, gray fox, turkey, red fox, coyotes, bear cubs. There's 2 of them there. And there's mama bear rolling around in the Obsession for Men. After another year, no tracks, no scat, no deer kills, no evidence. So I've had these cameras out for 5 years. I've spent thousands of hours on the ground following up reports. And I don't have any evidence. So I joined the Eastern Cougar Foundation. What's going on? All right, I can't. Someone's asking to be admitted here. And for some reason, I'm not. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I joined the Eastern Cougar Foundation in 2006, where I've been very fortunate to have been tutored by some of the top cougar biologists and advocates in the country, and where I learned that their experience was very much like mine, but they've been doing this since 1998 as a foundation from Nova Scotia to Mississippi, and some of them decades longer on their own. And in all of that time, we have one photograph of a mountain lion on the East Coast, north of Florida. So as I go through the talk, I hope you begin to get a sense about why it's so hard to find evidence despite hundreds of sightings of these cats up and down the East Coast. Okay, so let's talk about these cats, their history and evolution, their range, their habitat, biology, human predation, because people say, why do you want to bring a cat back that eats people? Hoaxes, sightings, evidence, and then ecology. So cougars have the widest range of any animal in the Western Hemisphere. Because of that wide range, they have lots of regional names, including Puma concolor, which is their Latin scientific name, Puma, cougar, panther, mountain lion, something like 150 names at last count. The closest cousins are the jaguarundi and the cheetah, which were once native to North America, as were saber-toothed tigers, American lions, and dire wolves, and mammoths and mastodons and camels, and giant sloths. So when I was growing up, we were taught that these animals all died off at the end of the last ice age because the weather changed. We now know that's not the case because these animals all survived the multiple warming and cooling trends over millions of years. What they couldn't survive, apparently, was guess what? Man's first presence in North America. Okay. Clovis man came across the Bering Strait, probably with hunting dogs, and began wiping out the mammoths and mastodons, camels, and giant sloths, which left nothing for these big predators to eat. Cougars that are here now recolonized from Central America during the last 10,000 years. Melanie Culver, one of our founding directors, did a genetic study back in the 1990s, and she found that what were thought to be 32 separate subspecies were just 6, 5 in Central and South America and 1 in North America. So genetically, a Florida panther is no different from an Eastern cougar, if we can find one, or a cougar from the Rockies. Okay, their anatomy and physiology. Their adult size, the bodies are about 4 feet long. The tails are almost as long as the body. They're thick, they're ropey, they have that black tip on the end. Their weights can range from 80 pounds for a small female to 200 pounds for a big male. They can hit speeds of 50 miles an hour, but unlike cheetahs, they don't race their prey down. They're stalk and ambush hunters. They like to get as close to their prey as they can using available cover. Then they're on top of them in 1 or 2 bounds. The colors can range from yellow and tawny to light brown and gray. They have white on the belly and the chest, white on the front of the muzzle, and then black on the back of the ears. We're going to talk about those ears a little bit later. Okay, those big canines are pretty much designed to do one thing, and that's to slide between the neck vertebrae of a deer and sever its spinal column. They can't get the deer that way. They'll move around to the front and use a chokehold. There's video on YouTube of a cougar taking down a deer in Colorado using a chokehold, and you can see that it's over in about 40 seconds. They like to make quick, fast kills. Front teeth are designed to pluck fur off the carcass. Back teeth work like scissors. They cut ribbons of meat off the carcass and swallow them whole. Okay, the ranges. For mature animals, females have smaller overlapping ranges, about 25 square miles, depending on prey availability. And one male will patrol the territory of 3 or 4 females, breeding with those females and keeping out other males. Transients are young adults that are moving out of their mom's territory for the first time. Females tend to stay with mom until they're about 2 years old. Then they move into the next male's habitat or the next male, but they tend to stay within about 100 miles of where they're born. Young males, on the other hand, have to get out of their dad's territory by the time they're about 18 months old. Otherwise, dad's going to kill them. Then they got to get past the next big male and the next big male and the next big male. So they're all the way on the edge of the breeding habitat, looking for females and trying to establish their own territory. And part of why we see these guys going 400, 600, 800 miles in the Midwest is because they're looking for females that aren't there, and they just keep going until something stops them. Okay, kittens are born 2 to 4 to a litter. They have blue eyes and spotted coats. They can keep those spots sometimes until they're full grown. You get photographs of some of these guys moving in the Midwest. They're full grown, but they still have their kitten spots. This is the cat we call Walker that was killed in Connecticut in 2011, photographed in Wisconsin a 1.5 years earlier. And you can see he still has his kitten spots. Okay, they're opportunistic predators. They'll take just about anything. But in the United States and Canada, about 80% of their diet are deer. Your average cougar will take about 30 deer a year, and a female with cubs will take about 1 a week. We often hear from people, if they bring cougars back, they're going to wipe out the deer herd. We've got 1 million deer in New York State. Hunters take about 250,000 a year. They replenish that population every single year. 100 cougars in the Adirondacks would take about 4,000 deer a year, which wouldn't make a dent in that population. After the kill, they pluck fur off the carcass. They open the chest cavity. This is how you can tell a cat kill, because bobcats will do this as well, from a coyote or a wolf or a bear kill. They'll feed on the heart and the liver first, and they'll scrape debris over the carcass and continue feeding on it for up to a week. So all that feeding produces lots of this, scat. There aren't too many things out in the woods that leave a scat as big as a cougar's. More than a foot long, more than an inch wide, and you haven't lived until somebody has sent you this in the mail for analysis, which we do get from time to time, and I've sent a few of those out myself. Okay, we often hear from people that they find tracks as big as their hands. Well, if they're that big, it can't be a cougar print, because while the paws are big, the front paw is bigger than the back paw. Tracks they leave are relatively small, about 3.5 by 3 inches, which is smaller than the palm of my hand. Okay, the toes are asymmetrical. They're like our fingers. They have a lead toe like our middle finger. When you see the tracks in the snow, you can tell left from right by looking at those toes. They have a heel pad that's shaped like a big fat M, right? And then you rarely see claw marks in a cougar track because they have retractable claws, just like your house cat. They don't use those when they're going about the daily business. So these are some of the features we look for when people send us photographs of tracks, and most of the time those are canine. Turk is our director, Kerry Geikus' shepherd down here next to a coyote print. And notice on the canines how the toes are symmetrical. You have clear nail indentations. Turk weighs about 75 pounds, but his track is about the same size as a 100 to 120 pound cougar. Heel pad has 1 lobe on top and 2 lobes on the bottom. And you see this X or star feature between the toes and the pad, which you don't see on cat tracks. So here they are side by side. That's a cast taken from a dead cougar on the right, my hand, and there's a track as big as my hand. That's actually the alpha male from the first pack of wolves that re-entered the Northern Rockies and Yellowstone, or Glacier National Park, back in the 1980s. My brother was a student at the University of Montana who was working with biologists who were studying that pack of wolves. And here they are side by side. Again, note the differences, the symmetry of the toes, the nail indentations, the asymmetry here, no nail marks, 2 lobes there, 3 lobes there, 1 here, 2 there, and this X or star feature between the toes and the pad. What's ironic is that even though these tracks are much different in size, these animals are probably about the same size. Wolves rarely go over 100 pounds. Your average cougar is between 100 and 120. So because we can't go tracking mountain lions on the East Coast, if you want to do it, you got to go out to the Front Range of Montana and take Jay Tischendorf's Cougar Ecology and Tracking class. Jay's a wildlife veterinarian who, among many other things, worked on the reintroduction of red wolves in North Carolina and the first study of mountain lions in Yellowstone National Park back in the 1980s. He's one of the most experienced wildlife vets in the country, and he's been my good friend and mentor for the last 15 years. That's not a bottle of Budweiser in Jay's hand. That's bear spray, because we were in grizzly country. Grizzlies, wolves, cougars, elk, moose, bighorns, mountain goats, wolverine, lynx, bobcat, you name it, they got it. And even though this was early February, you were getting reports that the big boar grizzlies were moving out of their dens. So we had our bear spray with us just in case. And what we were doing was simply driving up roads looking for tracks. And the first morning, we cut mountain lion tracks in about, let's try this, in about 90 minutes. So Jay's measuring the rear right track there. That's the smaller one. You can tell it's the right track by that lead toe. Measuring the stride, more than 40 inches, so this was a male. We had perfect tracking conditions, about a ½ inch of fresh snow. We're about a half hour behind him. Your average cougar leaves between 10 and 20,000 tracks every single day. He went across this creek. As soon as we got in the woods, on the other side of the creek, we found our first territorial scrape. We found our first wild, free-range, deer-fed cougar poop. You have no idea how many of these things I looked at before I saw a real one in situ. This was a big moment for me. We found one of his dens. We found this perch where he stopped to check out this valley right behind that house. So you can see the people are living out there with the wolves and the cougars and the grizzlies. So that morning, we decided to turn around at that point. We found 4 scrapes, 2 scats, 1 den, followed more than 1,000 tracks in just a half mile in a couple of hours. So that's more field evidence than anybody's found on the East Coast, north of Florida, since 1938. So when you have a mountain lion around, it's not hard to find evidence. Very often we get reports of moms with kittens or big kittens on the East Coast. So imagine how much evidence a family of cougars would live if that's all the evidence you get from one cat in one morning. So if we had evidence of these cats out there, we should be finding lots of it. All right, I'm going to cut through those. So this is Carrie Geikus, one of our directors, who was out there with Jay a couple of years before me. The one thing I didn't see was a kill. They were tracking a female who led them to one of her kills. This is an elk calf. So every winter after the first snowfall, we have 1 million hunters out in the woods in New York and New England. Hunters, trappers, houndsmen, snowmobilers, cross-country skiers, lots of them good, solid woods people, not to mention all the people doing field research with the state agencies and universities. And no one's coming back with any evidence like this. So we should be seeing this if we had mountain lions here. My other point is to remind you what cougars eat, which isn't us, not very often. There's been about 150 of, people call them attacks. They're not really attacks. They're actually hunting us since 1970, and 24 deaths. Almost all the cats that are implicated in these incidents are juveniles out on their own for the first time. Cougars aren't raised or trained or evolved to hunt us, but every once in a while, a young cat is usually forced into marginal habitat to try to take a crack at us. And 2/3 of the time, it's a kid, for the same reason they're going to go after a fawn or a yearling deer. What animal do you think kills more people than all of the wildlife combined in the United States? Vehicle collisions with deer kill 200, injure 20,000, and cause $6 billion of property damage a year. So this is 1 month of deer incidents versus over 50 years of cougar incidents. And just 4 people have been killed in the United States since 1998. These actual numbers are actually dropping because the longer they live next to us, the smarter they get and the less conflict there is. And of course, if we brought mountain lions back, one study found recently that we reduced vehicle collisions with deer by 22% over 30 years. Right, so let's talk about evidence. Maurice Honecker is the grand old man of cougar research, studied them out in Idaho back in the 1960s. And Maurice predicted a few decades ago that lions will hit the Mississippi in the next decade. The East and Midwest are beautiful cat country, full of deer and cover. So how do we know they're coming out of these source colonies in the Dakotas and hitting the Mississippi River? Well, never mind going out and looking for field evidence. Everywhere cougars roam, even in the lowest densities, which is what this is, we get what's called incidental evidence. They get hit by cars, trucks, and trains. They get shot. They wander into towns and cities: Kansas City, Omaha, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, and dozens of smaller towns, but not Cleveland or Buffalo or New York or Boston or Bangor or Burlington or Lake Placid. Greenwich, Connecticut, but no place else. This guy was treated by houndsmen 3 days in a row outside of Spooner, Wisconsin. We have thousands of people running hounds on the East Coast. None of them are treating cougars. And then never mind putting out remote wildlife cameras. Cougars wander in front of these cameras all the time. There are 300,000 of them sold commercially every single year. This guy wearing a radio collar tripped a whole series of cameras across northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan back in 2011, and we knew it was the same cat because it was wearing that radio collar. These photographs stop at the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have none further east, even though we have more cameras, more deer, and more hunters on the East Coast. So let's talk about these sightings. Hundreds of them up and down the East Coast every single year. And for the last 25 years, people have been sending us photographs of their sightings. Very often, they are partial photographs like this one. So you can't see the tail. The coat looks right. But earlier, I said cougars have black on the back of their ears. Those are white and pointed. So that is a bobcat reported as a mountain lion. Here from Pennsylvania, again, you can't see the tail, spotting along the flanks. You got white on the back of the ears. So again, another bobcat reported as a mountain lion. Fred Scott looked at the different feline species and found out they have different body characteristics for different species. So cougars have small heads and long tails in proportion to their bodies. House cats have big heads and short tails in proportion to their bodies. And bobcats fall somewhere in the middle. And of course, they have that short, stubby tail. So we get a photograph like this. We don't have to go out and measure the corn and the grass. You can tell from the body proportions that that is a house cat reported as a mountain lion. Another house cat reported as a mountain lion. So yes, it's hard to believe that folks are mistaking a cat as big as us for bobcats and house cats, but that's what we've been seeing for the last 25 years. We did not expect this to happen, folks. Paul Beyer was the first biologist to study them in Southern California in the suburbs back in the 1990s. At the end of his study, he went back and counted all the times he was sent out on a cougar call, and it turned out to be something else. So 95% of those calls were misidentifications in cougar habitat. So what does that say about all these sightings that we have on the East Coast and we can't find any evidence? Then we get photographs like this one. First reported to us from Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut. How do we know right away that that is not Cornwall, Connecticut? Those are ponderosa pines, which are native to the Rockies. But that didn't stop this photograph and its series from going viral. People were sending them to us from up and down the East Coast. My cousin took this, my brother took this, my uncle took this. 2 weeks later, we found out that it was taken outside of Casper, Wyoming. And a couple of years ago, one of the rangers at the Mohonk Mountain House got this picture sent to him, reported from Minnewaska. Kevin showed it to me. I hadn't seen it before, but I didn't try to track it down until the Mohonk Preserve contacted me a few weeks later saying it was on their property. So I did a little Google search because we have a deciduous forest here, like we have around here. But since we don't have mountain lions, the place where we do have deciduous forests and mountain lions sometimes is the upper Midwest Great Lakes, which I Googled, and this picture popped up from Minnesota in 2011, which begs the question, why do people have to hoax these photographs? Because yes, cougars are elusive, but we get photographs of them in their most intimate moments all the time. Nursing in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, moving a den in Florida. This is that video I was talking about from Colorado. A deer kill, 3 minutes long, shot through a windshield. Another deer kill in Santa Monica, California. This one was taken from a tree stand by a hunter back in 2009 in Indiana. There have been millions of hunters up in tree stands every fall east of Indiana for the last 15 years. All those guys have cell cameras now. And this is the easternmost photograph we have from a tree stand and from a cell phone. You have pictures like this happening. They get caught in bobcat and coyote and wolf traps all the time, but not east of the Mississippi River. And then every year in Florida, we have about 200 panthers in the southwestern part of the state. 25 get killed on the roads every single year. So if we had 200 mountain lions spread out over the East Coast, we should be seeing a comparable number of road kills a year. And we're not, we've got one. And also from Florida, turkey hunters who are calling turkeys in are actually drawing panthers into their sets. And some of these guys are getting 2, 4, 6 minutes of videos of the panthers coming into those sets. That's not happening north of Florida, where you have lots and lots of other turkey hunters. For the last 50, 60 years, we do get evidence of a mountain lion on the East Coast. Where are they coming from? They're former captives. This guy has a 6-month-old cougar. Another 6 months, that cat would be a lot bigger and a lot harder to handle. And we now know that people let them go. Cats that are bred for the exotic pet trade are bred from Latin American stock. They're smaller, they have shorter, creamy colored fur. And half the conformations that we have in Eastern Canada are cats with Latin American DNA. So that's what's been out there on the East Coast since the 1950s, these former captives, until this guy. June 5th, 2011, Greenwich, Connecticut. This is the only photograph ever taken of a living wild mountain lion on the East Coast north of Florida. And the gentleman who took this happened to be the son of a woman who volunteers down at the Wolf Conservation Center. I've done this talk a couple of times. They sent it to me. He took this through a screen door. I couldn't tell if that was his tail or his trailing leg. Sent it to a couple of our computer guys, but by that afternoon, the Connecticut DEP had confirmed this as a mountain lion. All hell breaks loose. Boys' school gets closed. Road race gets canceled. There's hundreds of sightings suddenly in Greenwich, Connecticut. So 2 nights later, I happened to do this talk in Connecticut, and where I suggested, God forbid, that if this cat gets hit or shot, it's going to turn out to be somebody's pet. Jason Hawley, one of the state biologists, happened to be there that night. He came up, introduced himself afterwards. We had a nice chat, went home, and 4 hours later, he was hit on the Merritt Parkway, 35 miles east of Greenwich. So when we got news that weekend of him being hit, Jason and I contacted each other. We helped them with their necropsy of him. John Landre, our vice president at the time, helped them determine he was about 3 years old by looking at his teeth and gums. We recommended a lab to do the DNA analysis out in Montana, which has the biggest cougar DNA database in North America. When the DNA came back, it turned out he was not a former captive. It turned out that his DNA matched the DNA from the Black Hills. In fact, he had left evidence all the way across the country for a year and a half. He was first spotted on a police dash cam outside of St. Paul. He made it into Wisconsin, where they tracked him for 3 months. Then they lost him in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where he was the first cat photographed there. Probably crossed into Ontario. A year later, a woman up in Lake Georgia doing her dishes. Floodlight goes on, mountain lion goes through the backyard. She says, "Hey, honey, a mountain lion just went through the backyard." Her husband, who was a retired DEC ranger, said, "Yeah, right." Went out the next morning, found the tracks with the DEC biologist, picked up some of his fur, sent that fur to Melanie Culver, who didn't get back to them for several months. By that time, the news from Connecticut had come in. They sent the remaining sample to the lab in Montana, and they got a perfect match. So it's a remarkable story. As far as we know, this is, it was the longest dispersal of any mammal that we know of in North America, but was eclipsed recently by a wolf. But why did he go 2,000 miles? What was he out there going from South Dakota to Connecticut? He was looking for a girlfriend, right? So if he found a female anywhere along that route, he would have stopped and mated with her and settled in to defend his territory, which is why we know there aren't any females out there. So one of the things we've been doing besides tracking these guys is looking at the number of mortalities coming out of these source colonies every year, because that's how we know how many cats are actually on the landscape, and trying to get a sense about whether or not they're going to recolonize the Midwest on their own. The most we ever had in one year was 2011. We had 16 of them. One was a female. She traveled really far from the Black Hills to Tulsa. She was captured. Now she's in a zoo in Kansas. So you can't have recolonization in the Midwest if your females are getting captured. And also the Black Hills, which is the primary source. So you see all of these, again, all of these confirmations over the last 30 years, and every single one of them, we think, have died. None of these cats established a home territory, except possibly for one guy right here at this cluster in the Ozarks. And what's happening in the Black Hills is that they've also raised their hunting quotas, which is reducing the number of dispersers. So this is where they've raised the quotas to, started dropping those after 2012, and they haven't hit those quotas ever since. So when you start taking that many cats out, you reduce the number of dispersers because there's more habitat for them in the Black Hills. And they're also targeting females, which are over harvesting. And you see them raising the harvest limits there, which they've slowly started to drop. But when that happens, you overhunt the females, your population starts to decline. So again, that's why we have fewer dispersers moving into the Midwest. Panthera, which is part of a new group called the Cougar Research Collaborative, just did a whole bunch of research focused on the Midwest and recolonization there. And they announced in a couple of conferences this spring that their forecasts don't look good for cougars recolonizing the Midwest on their own. But something interesting has happened in the last 6 or 7 years. Females weren't showing up in the Midwest for 25 years. All of a sudden, 5 of them did since 2015. There's a small colony in central Nebraska called the Niobrara River Valley. I think they're possibly coming out of there. Unfortunately, the first 2, Tennessee and the Ozarks, disappeared after they appeared, and these 3 in Iowa were shot. So you can't have recolonization if your females aren't finding males or disappearing or getting shot. So again, anybody who's looking deep enough at this data will see that they're not going to recolonize the Midwest on their own. And again, It's taken them 25 years to get from the Black Hills to the Niobrara River Valley, across some of the most lightly populated areas in the lower 48. It's another 600 miles for them to get to the Ozarks, and another 450 miles to get from here to this good habitat in Minnesota. So how long is it going to take them if it's taken them 25 years to get just this far? So this is what we've been up to for the last 25 years. All that research, we determined by 2008 what we did know in 1998, that there were no breeding populations of cougars on the East Coast. So now what do we do? Let's talk about bringing them back, either through recolonization or through reintroduction. So we changed our name from the Eastern Cougar Foundation to the Cougar Rewilding Foundation, and rewilding simply means restoring native species to the native habitat. This is the cougar's historic range on the East Coast. People say we can't bring them back to the East. It's too developed, too many people. Well, look at California. We've got 40 million people and 5,000 cougars, the most of any state. An area and human population comparable to Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia combined. If they can make it in California, they can certainly make it here because we have way more deer and way more habitat. This is P22. You may have read about him. Passing away over the winter. He lived in Griffith Park in the middle of Los Angeles for 10 years. Los Angelinos loved him. He had his own Facebook page and Twitter account. They are painting murals of him all over the city. This cat taught us that mountain lions and people can be good neighbors together. He was a wonderful ambassador for the mountain lions. These two wandered down out of the San Gabriel Mountains, plopped themselves down on someone's front lawn. It's mom and her big cub. They called the police. The police showed up. They didn't take out their guns. They didn't call for backup. They didn't take the cats out and hail of gunfire. What they do, they turned on their sirens and they shooed them away. Why? Because people in LA have gotten used to living with mountain lions the same way that people in New Jersey have gotten used to living with black bears. I have relatives in the Bay Area. Every time I go out there, I go around looking at all the posted mountain lion habitat. On the left here, this is Pacifica, 5 miles south of the San Francisco city line. It's completely built out north of here, but mountain lions are using the available habitat that are there. These folks are taking their morning walks in San Pedro Valley Park, where the cats are. My wife ran a foot race in there several years ago. This is Los Gatos, about an hour down Silicon Valley. I spent a day tracking a female to her den with the UC Santa Cruz Puma Project. Her den was about a quarter mile from the edge of town here and about 100 yards from this access road where hundreds of people every day were walking and cycling and walking their kids. We did find her den. Unfortunately, she hadn't made a kill in over a week and her kittens had starved to death. Up here on the right, this is Berkeley, this is Oakland, this is the ridge east of those cities. There's a couple of big parks up there, Tilden Park, Redwood Canyon Park, where you can see that people are walking their dogs and walking their toddlers in posted mountain lion habitat. So these guys can make it in just about any habitat. They're as adaptable as coyotes are. When we talk about bringing them back to the East Coast, you don't want to bring them back to New Jersey to start. You want to bring them back to places like the Adirondacks, which is 3 times the size of Yellowstone. John Wandre did a habitat analysis, a peer-reviewed habitat analysis, suggesting that the Adirondacks could support up to 350 mountain lions. Other places we could bring them back, Catskills, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did a reintroduction of Texas cougars to southern Georgia 30 years ago. A couple got hit, a couple got shot. We know they can make it in eastern habitat. Okay, why do you want to bring them back? This is the most important part. We're almost finished here. Hang with me. It's an ecological imperative. Cougars, like wolves and bears, are what are called keystone species. The big predators require more habitat than everything else. You protect habitat for them, you protect all the other critters under their umbrella. And we also know that the cougars guard and shepherd ecosystems. What do I mean by that? Border collie will help a sheep herder move a herd of sheep from one pasture to another to allow that first pasture to regrow. When wolves were restored to Yellowstone in 1995, they began to have the same effect on elk as a border collie does on sheep, but they were doing it naturally. With wolves back on the landscape, elk had to stop browsing like cattle. They had to start looking over their shoulders. When that happened, trees like aspens and cottonwoods that hadn't grown in Yellowstone since wolves were exterminated started to grow back. This is a creek before the wolves on the left. This is that same creek 5 years later Those willows are growing in there because that's a potential ambush site. An elk doesn't want to get caught dead there. When the willows came back, beaver came back, fish came back, frogs came back, birds and butterflies came back. Your biodiversity in Yellowstone began to explode, not because the wolves were killing so many elk, but because they were changing the way the elk browse. John Landry, our vice president, was the first biologist on the ground documenting this phenomenon, wrote the first peer-reviewed paper on it. This is the most significant development in conservation biology in the last 25 years. Predators regulate ecosystems. Other biologists went to see if they could find it happening other places. They went down to Zion National Park in southern Utah, where they found Zion Canyon was overrun by mule deer, and that same creek there was in that same condition as that creek back in Yellowstone. But in another canyon 9 miles east of Zion Canyon called North Canyon, they found the entire ecosystem intact. The only difference they could find between Zion Canyon and North Canyon was that there were cougars in North Canyon, but there were none in Zion Canyon. So cougars were having the same effect on mule deer as the wolves were on the elk back in Yellowstone. So back in Montana, we saw mule deer herds as big as any whitetail herds I've seen here, but we're also finding this sapling regeneration in this retired utility corridor. And it's happening because you've got the wolves and the cougars and the grizzlies acting as predator shepherds of the elk and the mule deer. So what does this mean for the East Coast? Cades Cove, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, 46 species of wildflower in 1970 were gone by 2004, all of them relished by white-tailed deer. It's a quote from a book called Where the Wild Things Were, which traces the ecology studies over the last 100 years, culminating in the research in Yellowstone and Zion. When you lose your predators, ecosystems collapse. Back here in the Clove every winter, when it snows, I go out to see if I can find evidence of those dozen cougar reports. That's my old hound Tonka. Behind the dam there, see the beaver. We're active in the winter. Or every March when that creek melts out, I go out to watch the woodcocks do this spectacular spring mating ritual. And I was out there one night right around dusk, watching a female beaver with one of her kits over here, the ripples there. Then I moved over into the fields to watch the woodcocks do their thing. And ducks were flying by and geese were honking in the wetland behind me. And 2 great horned owls flew by, 3 great blue herons flew over. The coyotes started yipping like the Serengeti Plain. We get 500,000 visitors to the Gunks every single year, and I've seen maybe a half dozen people in these fields during the last 15 years. This is kind of like my private slice of heaven on earth. It's my favorite place in the world, and it is dying. This is an invasive species called Japanese stiltgrass. It lines both sides of the creek for miles. This is behind my old house in Rosendale. This stuff just came right down the canal, right over the banks, right into the understory in one season. How's it do that? It does that because the deer have cleared out everything else, and deer don't eat Japanese stiltgrass, which is why we're losing ground nesting habitat on the East Coast. Past the stiltgrass is a native plant called hay-scented fern. It's native, but it starts to act like an invasive species because deer don't eat it. So as these trees begin to age and die and collapse, there are no seedlings or saplings to replace them. As if we have anything else to worry about, folks. This is what's happening to our forests on the East Coast. They are no longer regenerating because of deer overbrowsing. A couple of years ago, I did a survey of the gunks, the climbing crags here. I found this plant popping up all over the cliffs. It's called white snake root. It's toxic to deer. I also found it that morning all over the West Traps parking lot. So climbers are picking it up on their shoes and their clothing and their gear, and they're introducing it to the cliffs. This is a pitch pine, which are common on Cape Cod and Long Island and Jersey pine barrens, but they're rare on mountaintops. So potentially these plants are going to start crowding out our pitch pines. The Biodiversity Partnership that manages the ridge has been trying to knock back the deer herd with a grant from the DEC. And believe it or not, we can't recruit enough hunters to take out 100 deer a year off the ridge for 3 years, which would get regeneration going in these forests. But if we had a half dozen cougars roaming the ridge, this is about the same area as the Santa Monica Mountains in Los Angeles, we'd be seeing regeneration in our forests, same way we're seeing regeneration in Yellowstone and Zion. So cougars are critical for the functioning of ecosystems. They interact with up to 485 species, which is more than any other animal ever recorded. So cougars were once native to the East Coast. They're part of our native heritage. We know they can make it in eastern landscapes, and we know that people out west like having them around. They don't want to see their numbers reduced. And we also know from public attitude surveys that not only do they want to see cougars come back on their own, they want to see them restored to the right places, like the Adirondacks and Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And that's why we're working to restore cougars to all of their former range. And thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I'm for it.
Thank you.
How can you relocate a cougar to the Adirondacks or to here?
Well, first of all, you have to do public attitude surveys, which have been done. You have to do habitat surveys, which have been done. Then you have to convince the DEC to do it, because that is their purview. And state wildlife agencies tend to not want to bring back wolves or mountain lions because the agencies tend to see their primary constituents as hunters and fishermen. And not all hunters see mountain lions and wolves as competition for the deer, but some of them do, and they tend to be the most vocal. And so the DEC doesn't seem to be much interested. I spent a couple of years back in 2015 working on the state wildlife action plans with the DEC for mountain lions and for wolves, and where I got the distinct impression that New York is not interested in bringing them back. That doesn't mean it can't be done by legislation. And of course, the national parks like Great Smoky Mountain National Park do have a mandate to recover their native fauna. They did attempt a red wolf reintroduction, which did not go well, but they do have a history of attempting to bring back a big predator there. So that is probably the best potential place to do it on the East Coast.
But physically, how would you do it? Trap a male and a female and fly them over here?
You would want to do, you would want to recreate a typical breeding colony. So you have like 3 or 4 females with 1 male. And you would want to have those 3 or 4 females related. So you would have an older mom and a couple of her older adult female cubs, because that way they are less likely to disperse. They're going to stay in the same area. South Dakota has said that anybody who wants their mountain lions can bring them anywhere they want to. So, so that's where probably we would try to get them from. There have been part of the Florida Panther Recovery Plan for the last 30 years has been to relocate them. They did a test release, as I mentioned. They did the habitat studies. They did the public attitude studies. They had good support for them, but they actually never followed up and reintroduced panthers outside of southern Florida. And they've kind of squandered their goodwill over the last 30 years. So I don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I want to explore this thing about mountain lions or cougars being comfortable around people. We worked really hard to keep the black bears getting too comfortable with people, you know, raiding garbage cans, bird feeders. Can you talk about this sort of yin and yang between keeping them wild and making them comfortable around people?
So, as I mentioned, the individuals that tend to get into trouble are adolescents because they're moving into habitat. Mom and dad have the good habitat, and the young ones looking for habitat tend to get pushed into the marginalized habitat, which tends to be on the fringes of where people live. They are living around and even within the boundaries of every single city out west of Rapid City, South Dakota. So, as I mentioned, the longer they live next to us, the smarter they get. The older cats in particular get to be old because they don't tangle with people and pets and livestock. And when an animal does do that, they get taken out, they get killed. They don't get to teach that behavior to another litter of cats. Also, if it's a first incident, they will often haze that cat or move that cat. Moving doesn't necessarily help because you're moving them into habitat that they've already been forced out of. But we have learned over the years how to do this in any number of the states out west. So, when I was on tracking them on the edge of Los Gatos, I mean, this was right on the edge of Silicon Valley. I mean, we were 10 miles from San Jose, which has 1 million people. Los Gatos is a town of 33,000 people. The ridge, that habitat reminded me very much of what Rockland County is like, where you have all that development right up against Harriman and Tuxedo. So what they were learning from their research is that the cats tend to avoid us, even when they're feeding. They make kills right in people's backyards. They'll feed on them at night. If someone walks by, they hear a human voice, they leave that kill, and they won't come back to it. So, so the best thing we can do is to allow them to learn how to adapt to us. I understand that bears are certainly more of a problem than cougars are because they have a larger, they eat more stuff than cougars do. Cougars tend to be, what's the word? They eat only meat, basically. So they don't get in the garbage the way bears do. And they tend to only eat meat that they kill. They will scavenge from time to time, especially if they're hungry, but we don't see a lot of the kind of incidents that we do with black bears. So I would suggest that the best thing to do is just to allow them to live next to us. And then they and both them and us will learn how to live the longer we live together.
Anybody else? Well, Chris, thanks for enlightening us on cougars. And anybody else? Oh, Leola?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So Chris, across the Catskills, I'm actually looking at them across the river right now, in Columbia County. We have 140 acres, and somebody, has a camera and they say they see a cougar. So I imagine it's not a mountain lion. But what are the likelihoods that we could, and I realize you kind of went over this already, but how likely is it that either a mountain lion could be here or that it could potentially be reintroduced?
As we saw with the cat that traveled from South Dakota, anything is possible. And even though the exotic pet laws have gotten more strict over the last few decades, people do keep them as pets still. They can get them on the black market. So there's always the possibility of one showing up either as a former captive who's been released or gotten out, or one of these young males traveling. But I would say the chances are not likely. It's not impossible. And again, with respect to the reintroductions, there's nothing in place in any state in the Midwest or the East Coast happening right now. So I think what it will probably take is actually somebody with a lot of pull and a lot of money who might want to take this on as a pet project. I think someone like that could do it. So unfortunately,
because we're rewilding as best we can. We recognize the understory problem and the invasives, and we really are tackling that because our primary focus with this 140 acres is to increase biodiversity, which is so important. So a cougar then, having a cougar present on the land, at least we believe from the camera, that just it doesn't seem to be keeping down the deer pressure enough. And so how come a mountain lion might, but a cougar isn't?
Well, they're the same. They are the same cat, right? And you're welcome to send that photograph to us, Cougar Rewilding, or actually my email address is spatzcat61@gmail.com. We'd be happy to look at it. We get photographs like this all the time, and I would love to, I would love to find a photograph of a mountain lion in Dutchess County. That would be fantastic.
Columbia County, yeah. So, okay, sorry, can
Columbia
you type
County,
your
sorry.
email into the chat?
Yep. How do I do
Thanks.
that? Yeah. Yeah. So I can't, as I said, I can't say what you have. I would love to. I would hope you have a cat there. If you got a picture, it's not likely to probably stay there unless they're probably going to just keep moving through. Coyotes can and do take deer, but we found from a number of studies that coyotes, there's so much deer on the landscape, they don't have to hunt them. Up to 95% of coyote diet in New York State is scavenged deer. So yeah, so they're not really working on the deer as well. So you need
Yeah,
one.
but the scattered deer carcasses you mentioned, like
Mhm.
we have that on the land. We have this
Mhm.
that scat you showed. I swear I've seen that kind of scat. Now, of course, everybody wants to believe they've got it, so I'm not sure. But it's interesting because the evidence seems as if there is one present, or more than one. I don't know.
Well, I certainly hope that you do have one there, and do have more than one there. And if they aren't necessarily going to kill a lot of deer, what they will do is change the way the deer browse. So that's what we see them doing. They're not actually, wolves and cougars aren't killing so many of the prey species as they are changing the way that they browse. So unfortunately, once you have invasive species in place, once you have Japanese stiltgrass and haze-scented fern there, it's really tough to reverse that without simply removing it and then trying to protect, planting seedlings and saplings and trying to protect them. So unfortunately, once you've got that in place, having a wolf or cougar there isn't necessarily going to change what's happening in the understory very much.
Chris, one more question. Is there a similar effort to rewild these cats in Canada? I mean, Canada's even less densely populated than the United States.
There is not, unfortunately. And the closest breeding population in Canada to Eastern Canada is actually further west than it is in the United States. It's in Saskatchewan, about 50 miles north of central Montana. So them getting here on their own. We do have lots of dispersers showing up. And actually some of them are coming out of the Dakotas because they're wearing collars and they end up getting trapped in Manitoba. But they have shown up. We have had confirmations of cats in Quebec and Ontario, but again, half the DNA that we have on those are former captives. So, and the exotic pet laws in Eastern Canada are a lot less stringent than they are in the United States. So we do have more captive pets there. So that's what's been popping up. So unfortunately, they're not going to recolonize from Western Canada anytime soon. And there are no plans, as far as I know, for any of the provinces to reintroduce them.